Let's see, let's go ahead and begin. Is there any special prayer requests? Because tonight we're going to move into talking about a real significant section. It's kind of maybe one of the easiest sections for us to kind of get a handle on, because we understand how so much of what we do is storytelling, whether we're reading a novel, whether we're watching a movie. We're used to the form of storytelling, and a good bit of the Bible is wrapped up in that kind of that storytelling narrative form that just is kind of part of whatever. I think probably every culture does that as a way of both communicating and entertaining and all the rest. And so we'll be looking at Old Testament narrative in particular tonight, because it's a big piece of the Old Testament, and of course the Old Testament is a big piece of the Bible. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. That'll be our main focus will be on that type of material, and then a little bit about leadership or greatness. I know we had a chance to do. You'll have a chance to do an assignment this week, talking to people about how they view greatness, and we'll talk a little tonight about even how Jesus viewed greatness. And so we'll kind of make that the heart of what we deal with tonight. But before we get into that, again, if we have any specific prayer requests, we'd love to do that. And then I think Helen, who do we have for our prayer tonight?
For prayer tonight is myself.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, does anybody have any prayer requests, or everybody was okay? No? Okay. I wanted to start off by saying thank you, God, for giving us an opportunity to still be here today and follow through our course. I also want to put a prayer for everybody right now that is battling still COVID and has a loved one or somebody around them that may be battling COVID or any other disease. I also want to thank you for just in general giving us another day in this earth, and to please give us the guidance and power to pull through to this course and graduate in December. Amen.
Amen. That's so exciting. Think about it. Graduation is just a few months away. So good for you. Good. Okay, well, before we jump into this week's lesson, just a little bit of review from last week. How many, did any of you watch the entirety of the movie Les Miserables? Okay. Did all of you watch at least that first, 15 or 20 minutes of the movie? Okay. The idea behind the Les Mis, especially as it is a kind of a window into, the biblical idea of law is fun. I know there are probably every bib teacher at FPU uses it at least slightly. I like to use it a little bit more because I think it's a very, very intuitive and very creative way to look at and begin having a conversation about the importance of law, the importance of grace, and how those two concepts fit together. Because I think very much like what Grimsroot says, that is part of this overarching theme of the Bible is God's healing strategy. And so that healing strategy has to have a way of healing the brokenness. The fact that no one is perfect, and so no one is able to be a perfect rule keeper. And we sometimes get the idea that was the old way, but it really wasn't. It was never going to be, this is how you can become perfect by following the rules. That just became part of our best effort to become more perfect or less imperfect, maybe. But the idea of God's grace and the way God would intervene and move in a graceful way with broken and sinful creatures has been God's plan from the very beginning. And we started off that first week in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. And even in those initial stories about who God is and who we are, we see in chapter 2, when God created the Garden of Eden, and that whole narrative around Adam and then Eve, and then the creation of all, or the naming of all the animals and all the fun that goes into that. But even in that story, that Genesis 2, there are some rules to follow, and there are consequences to those rules if they're not followed. And we get that image, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of the knowledge of life, very important symbols as the Bible gets started for what's really at stake for us as humans, and how it is that God is going to operate with us. Because we see right away there in chapter 3, if you recall from that first week, we see in chapter 3 that almost immediately those rules are being broken. The man and the woman eat from that fruit that they were told not to. And so they begin to suffer the consequences of being rule breakers. But even as the consequences come to them, we see that God doesn't banish them from his presence. He doesn't say, I'll never help you again. He instead moves in very graceful ways. Even in that third chapter, we see, it is God who creates appropriate clothing for them. And though they can't stay in the garden, he kind of puts a little bit of something of a hedge of protection around them, so that as they go out into the wild, into the world that is not the garden, they'll have a chance. And so you see again, here is, as well as even the promise of Eve's descendant ultimately squashing the head of the serpent. So there is even in their failure to be good about following the rules, God is moving even in Genesis 3 in incredibly gracious ways to meet their brokenness with a plan, the beginnings of a plan to bring their healing. And so that's really, we look at it, Grimm's Root picks it up really nicely, I think, as we walk through the first couple chapters of Grimm's Root, and especially in Genesis, say up through chapter 11, and then into the covenant section in chapter 12, where Abraham and this healing strategy begins to take legs. We see the healing strategy take on new form as in Exodus, God's people received the law, a more complete law. But again, complete and full and total obedience, perfect obedience isn't ever going to be the expectation, because it never will be. But all along the way, there is woven into this description of God's rules is God's grace. And that's, I think, what makes it interesting, and especially as we look at something like the story, Victor Hugo's story of Les Mis, is that he pulls on some of those same tensions. What does it mean to be a follower of the rules? And you saw it in the clip you watched, the lawman played by I had his name on the tip of my tongue just a moment ago.
Javert.
Yeah, Javert. Yeah, Javert. He is clearly all about the rule. Not that he's a bad guy, and I think the article you read is good about that. That it's not that he is doing anything wrong or bad. He is just about following the rules, and he feels somehow he is honoring God by being about the rules. Whereas Jean Valjean, the hero of the story, and you see his being touched by grace when the priest extends to him the silver and doesn't condemn him for stealing it, but instead gives him that measure of grace that then touches him. If you were to watch the next 2 hours of that movie, what you would see is that from that moment, he is transformed. The angry thief that he once was is transformed into the grace-giving character of the story. And so Hugo's point is, I think, a very biblical point, and I think that's why I like to use it here in week 2, and encourage people, if you enjoy music, it's a fabulous play or in musical form as a movie. But beyond that, just the underpinnings of what it means for us to live in this world with both rule and grace, and what does it mean for us to understand how the Bible works, and what the point of all the rules and the laws are for us, and what's Jesus' purpose and point it all to. I think it's helpful. So I always want to check and see. Usually I have somebody takes the bait and they watch the whole movie, and then we can talk together about where they cried and where I cried, and everyone else gets bored and thinks we're silly. But we won't go down that path today. You'll have to just watch yourself and find out. Someday you'll watch and say, I bet this is where Professor John, I bet this is where he was crying, because there's a few points where I kind of lose it in that movie. But it's really a profound story. So, but for us tonight, moving forward, is I want to, again, just using Fee and Stewart kind of as our guide on in chapter 5, which is what you'll be reading this week. And again, not that you have read it yet this week, but you'll be reading it. And as I open up chapter 5, a couple things jump out right off the first page. That chapter opens up, well, it says this: the single most common type of literature in the Bible is narrative. And so that's kind of our theme tonight. Whereas last week was law or law codes, because that's a significant element of the Bible. The most common type of literature in the Bible is this thing we call narrative. In fact, almost 40% of the Old Testament is written in a narrative style. And a good bit of the New Testament is, although it's a little bit different, but a lot of the same features. Whereas, for example, in the New Testament, everything we read in the Gospels, the stories of Jesus' life, what he did, what he said, those would be the 4 Gospels to begin the New Testament, and then the book of Acts, which is the story of what happened in that first generation after Jesus was alive. Those are all written in a distinctly narrative form as well, and they make up about half of the New Testament. So narrative becomes a real important piece. And again, like I said earlier, narrative is fairly easy for us to understand, so long as we understand what the rules are for using it and interpreting it, understanding what it is and how it is we interpret it. So we'll look at a couple of different texts tonight, and a couple different pieces of narrative form, and let them kind of speak to us about how it is we break that down and understand it. Okay, I'm going to read one more little piece here out of the book. On page 94, which is the second page of the chapter, it gives a definition for what a narrative is. And it's I don't mean to be redundant or be too basic, but this is important to know, that narratives are stories, purposeful stories retelling the historical events of the past that are intended to give meaning and direction for a given people in the present. So again, I want you to hear that and understand what Fee and Stewart are doing. They're separating this out. It's not just a historical account without a purpose. The stories that the writers of the Old Testament selected to keep, because they don't have, I mean, think about it. You think the Bible is big now. If the Bible was an exhaustive telling of the story of 4,000 years of time, how long would that book be? I don't know. I can't imagine a book that would be that big. So they go through, they pick and choose, they give highlights and catch moments that they tell in story form, not just to say what happened before, but also to help us in the present begin to make sense of our world by reflecting on what happened before. And so the narrative takes on a very distinct purpose. And I know in the video I mentioned, and I know Fee and Stewart talk about it as well, that also some of the stories we read in the Old Testament can be very strange, but they have to be seen. They really have to be seen. One of the rules of interpreting them is that we have to look at them through the 3 lenses, not the 3 worlds, but the 3 lenses of the levels of the narrative. Old Testament narrative is needs to always be seen. What is this story? How does it fit in the larger overall story, the God's healing strategy according to Grimm's root? How does this story fit at that level, the meta narrative level? How does it fit in, for the Old Testament in particular, how does it fit in crafting a covenant people? So how does it fit in this Old Testament story as a whole? How does it make that point for what it meant for ancient Jews in the Old Testament? But then also at the surface level, at the story level, what is the narrative here? What is it saying? Why is it kept? How does the narrator kind of lead us through the story, and what are the points that the narrator wants us to hear? So not just we're educated about what happened in history, but how do we get the right point, the right message which comes out of the story? And we'll talk a little later, especially when we get into that section. We'll take a look at a section later on in 2 Samuel, which talks about King David. And there's a real good example in one of the stories of King David, that while we are hearing story about what happened, there's some real key lessons. And if we watch kind of the clues, but how the narrator sets the story, tells the story, kind of crafts the various tensions in the story, he's doing it with a real intentional idea to giving us a message from the story that can help us in our lives in the present, not just a history lesson of what happened 3,000 years ago. So those are the three levels. Again, if you haven't read chapter 5 out of Fee and Stewart yet, just pay close attention, especially the front half of that chapter. There's a lot of good things here, which helps us understand, again, how to best understand a very common part of our Bible narrative. So I hope you guys are enjoying. In fact, give me a little feedback. How are you guys enjoying the Fee and Stewart book so far? Because I hear everything from this is the best book I've ever read to this book was kind of a little too heady. It was too academic. It felt like I was in a seminary class, and it really didn't speak to me. So how's it going for you guys?
I enjoy it. I feel like sometimes I get, maybe in some of the words, I get kind of stuck when it comes to the reading.
Mm-hmm.
But usually I text Cassandra and we have questions. We kind
Good.
of like reached back to each other, but we do pretty, I think we get it. Cassandra.
Okay, so Cassandra is kind of your go-to person, huh?
Yeah, and same with Helen. I think in all of the text, to be honest, there's a lot of words that I have not been introduced to before, and so it's a lot of language that is kind of hard to understand. And so breaking it down takes me a while. And so, and even asking the girls, like what they, like their point of view of what the reading was is helpful, just so that I can get an idea of like, oh, okay, that's what they meant by this. And so, yeah, it's difficult sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's not an uncommon thing, and it's harder. I'll be honest, it's a little bit harder online because we don't have as much time, face to face. And I think some of that difficulty gets when we're spending 4 hours in the same room, talking the same talk, even looking at various things. There's something that just happens being present when we have an hour and a half on Zoom, which is great. But you lose some of that. And so sometimes we rely a little bit more on the text itself. And the text itself makes sense to me because, one, I've read it a number of times. But two, I've also been theologically trained. That's part of the reason I get to teach the course, is because I have some of that background. And so sometimes it can use words that I think should be common or understood, but they're really not. And so where that happens, Helen, if you run into a part that Cassandra can't help and Julia can't help, then shoot me an email, and I'll try to my best to at least, if not deal with it in email form, bring it back up at the class and say, okay, this is, because there's a lot in both this class as well as in the BIB 314. There's a lot of stuff that happens that easily falls into that category of a new vocabulary that because you've not had, courses on biblical interpretation before. And so like with any field of education, it's going to have its own unique vocabulary. And so when you're just getting that and it's coming so fast and you don't have time to really take it in, it is tricky. So yeah, thank you. Julia, I didn't hear you get a chance to wait out. Are you going to tell me the same? You're going to tell me different? How's it going?
Yeah, kind of the same. And I do like reading this because I feel like there's things that I didn't really think about when I'm reading like in Genesis and Exodus. And I think that this is really helping me understand it more. But like the girl said, sometimes I come across like certain words that I'm not sure about, or just different concepts that I'm not too sure about. But so far so good. I like it.
Okay, good. How about the videos? Tell me real quick, because this is kind of new. Clearly you're using a lot more videos now that we are less face-to-face. And I'm looking forward to being face-to-face again here in the months ahead. But I've found a lot of the videos that we have selected for the classes tend to be helpful. But I'd love your input on that. How are the videos been filling in?
I also really like the videos too. They are very, very helpful. I think I can speak for all of us. I think they're really helpful. Last week's videos with Professor Dave, I enjoyed watching those videos too. I thought about different things too that just didn't cross my mind, and it was interesting.
Yeah. Well, Dave is like I say, he's an interesting cat, no doubt about it. And like I say, one of my best friends. But he sees things through a different lens, and I think it's really helpful sometimes to just to provoke some thought. So good. I'm glad you are enjoying it. Okay. Well, this week one of the assignments, in fact, I think it's 3.1, is going to be an assignment called. Let me go do that. Let me pull it up. Then we can all look at it together. Let me see there it is. I should have had this more ready than I do, but here it is. Okay, so in 3.1, it's called the One Great Person Interview and Responses. And then there's going to be an essay attached to it. So the One Great Person project, if you've not had a chance to look at it yet, and maybe you have, maybe you haven't, is to talk to 10 different people. And I recommend, especially being we're future educators here, to include some children in your group. Now, you may not be with children now, but still find someone, whether it be family members or friends, where you can talk and get children to give you some input too, because it's good to hear. I think it helps the assignment become a little more clear when we have a wide smattering, a wide range of respondents. But we're going to have you do just a little bit of survey. We ask you to talk to 10 people, and clearly, if you're trying to do a scientific survey, you'd want to poll far more than 10. But this can become a little illustrative of how people think about what it means to be great, without asking them, say to them, what do you think makes greatness? Without getting definitions of it. If we simply ask this question, name for me someone that you feel is great. And you don't have to give them any more explanation than that. You don't have to tell them it's for my Bible class. You can tell them that. But if you tell them it's for your Bible class, they'll probably be trying to think of someone in the Bible who is great. And they'll try to, give the right answer, because everyone who you ask them a question it's just our human nature that we want to get the right answer. So assure the people that there is no one right answer. You're only looking for their opinion. And the opinion is for them to name somebody that they deem as great. If they have questions like great in what or great in what way, don't give them any help. Just say no, just name for me a great person and tell me why. And so when you get those two answers, who is that great person and why they consider them great, That's the part of the survey that you need to do. And then there's going to be a little bit of an evaluation, and you'll read it as you go through and you look at that 3.2. Look at for the essay. There's a short essay that follows that will, that's about 2 pages long, that will analyze those responses and look for characteristics or themes. For example, if young people tend to select people in their family or celebrities or people from history more or less than adults do. What are some of the key pieces? If you see a theme, coming forward about what people, who people say are great, look for what the underpinnings are. What is it that makes those people great? And maybe there's a theme there that people consider these attributes signs of greatness. And it becomes kind of a fun little interaction. And then of course, for your essay, we ask you to kind of do a little bit of interacting with the chapters out of Grimm's Root and also the teachings that Jesus gives on greatness. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight later on before the class is over. We'll look at one out of the book of Matthew. We'll have you look at one in your homework this week out of the Gospel of Mark. But just some of the teachings that Jesus had about greatness, and see, do you see a correlation? Does it kind of connect with those teachings, or is it kind of, or are those teachings irrelevant to what people think greatness is? So again, there's no real right answer. It's the answers that your respondents give to you. And then how does that then interact with the material from the class that we're working through? So that becomes step one. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Bible and greatness tonight. Partly we're going to look at a story later on, as I mentioned, out of 2 Samuel that touches on a story that kind of gives us a narrative way of answering that question. Because again, 40% of the Old Testament is in narrative form, and so a lot of the moral of the story is how we get what those definitions are. Sometimes I wish that, in some of these it'd be a little bit more textbook-like, and it would give me a straight, textbook definition. But the Bible doesn't do that. It kind of factors that into the story and allows us to discover the truth then for ourselves. And then also but that's kind of what that assignment is going to be about. So we're going to stop. Okay, does that make sense, that assignment? And again, how it is and why it is we go there. Okay, so for tonight though, I want to start in another piece of the narrative section. And so I'm going to ask you if you have your Bible out to go ahead and grab it up. And we're going to turn together to Deuteronomy chapter 17. If you've got your big red Bible, that's on page 279. If you don't have the big red Bible, then any Bible will do, but you have to find Deuteronomy chapter 17. So Deuteronomy is the 5th book in the Bible, so it's there near the beginning. Hence, it's on page 279. If you're working off a phone app, as long as you were with us in the New Revised Standard Version, we're okay. But we're going to read a little short section here, again, part of the narrative of again, how we discern what the Bible speaks about greatness to be. In the narrative, this is during the time of Moses, the children of Israel, as we read in Exodus this week, came out of Egypt and received the law and lived for about 40 years, roughly 40 years, in the wilderness before they came into what's called the Promised Land. Before they enter into the Promised Land, so near the end of those 40 years, this is where we find the book of Deuteronomy coming from. There's a conversation that we have here where God is telling Moses what he needs to tell the people about the day when they will have a king. Now, historically, the interesting part here to me is this, is that they won't have a king for like 500 years. But yet what a king, what are important features of what a king should be like is listed here in this Deuteronomy 17 section. So it's like God is giving them a job description for a great king here, and then they won't even use that job description for 500 years, but they have it because it becomes part of their record of what God said to them. And then eventually it will be the job description for each and every king who follows. Most of the kings, in fact, I will say all the kings, don't live up to this standard, but yet it is still what is put in the Bible account, part of the narrative about what you should look for when the day comes that you need to put a king over you. So that's a long, rambling explanation of where this is going to be. But we're going to look at that job description here. So Deuteronomy 17, we're going to begin in verse 14. And we'll go to the end of the chapter, which is at verse 20. And so I need just one who can volunteer to read that for us. But then everyone else, the rest of us are going to just listen and kind of take notes. What are the key attributes? And we'll talk about some of the reasons why those are attributes for a great king. So who's my volunteer?
Sorry, I want to ask, does anybody have it on ebook? Cassandra, by any chance, would you happen to know the page that you pull it up on your ebook?
It's actually exactly the same number that Professor said, 279.
279?
Mm-hmm.
I apologize, Lou.
No,
yeah.
It's more important, Helen, that we all be on the same page. So that's good.
Thank you. And then, okay, I'm on 279. Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So on 279, okay, we're going to begin it where the little number 14 is. That's the 14th verse of that 17th chapter. So who's my volunteer now that we're all together?
I can volunteer. It's 14 through
20 to the end of the chapter.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to start reading. It says, when you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as a king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not one of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priest. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God diligently. Observing
good.
all the words of his law and these statutes, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Helen. Yeah, a couple of things real quick before I go into it and dive into it. You struggled a little bit with one of the words, Levitical priest, and again, that's just part of our understanding it from a historical lens perspective. You know who those are. That's the at this point in the Old Testament, the priestly class came from the tribe of Levi, and so they're often referred to as Levitical priests. You'll see this moving forward. It's really not a major theme, but it's a word. If you understand who the Levites are, it helps us moving forward. Probably the most notable time when you hear that term Levite used again would be in the story of the Good Samaritan. I think we talked about that last week a little bit, that when the man is on the road and he's been robbed and beaten and left for dead, there are two people come by. One is a Levite and the other is a priest. And again, most of us, because we don't understand the Old Testament section and what a Levite is, we don't know what that means. And so for us, it's just somebody who comes by. But again, for someone in Jesus' day, when he's hearing the story, he knows exactly what it means to be a Levite. And that's exactly the same people that we're talking about here. These Levitical priests would be the ones who maybe 1,000 years later, when Jesus is on earth, they're the ones who are referred to as the Levites. So that is a whole lot about something that maybe has never been a question for you and you don't care who the Levitical priests were, but that's who we're talking about. These are the people who are keepers of the law. And so it makes sense in the context of this little story that they're the ones who are going to write the law for this king so that he can keep it with him and read it daily and observe the covenant that it contains. Okay, but what were some of the other aspects? And maybe, Helen, you did a great job. So maybe Cassie or Julia, what were some of the key aspects that we heard read? These are the things that are going to make someone a worthy king.
Well, I wrote down that that they were saying that they had to choose someone to be king, and I noticed that I was trying to highlight some of it, that that person may not have any silver or gold, and they must not acquire it in great quantities. So I think that just says that it has to be somebody that's humble and I didn't highlight the other thing that I wanted to talk about.
Okay, well, that's a good starting point. That is one of, there's probably, 5 or 6 or 7 things that it kind of points out, and that's a really good one to begin with. The idea of not having accumulated too much silver and gold, it does say that someone who then is going to be a really good leader, in fact, the ideal leader for the kingdom, will be not someone who's comes from the wealthy classes, which is an interesting thing, because if you think about how politics works in our day, you don't get elected to politics if you don't have money, or at least money behind you. And anyone who goes into politics, once they leave politics, they seem to always leave with more money than they went in with. So it's a weird thing how it happens. But yeah, the king for Israel is said not one who has much silver and gold, which again becomes quite an interesting dynamic there. Good. What are some of the other things they were either not to do, or things that they were to do?
That they couldn't be a foreigner, and that they couldn't have more than one wife. Okay,
very good. Yes, it says, there you go. Actually, that's more accurate. If I were writing this, I would say you can't have more than one, because that is in our culture what's considered appropriate, right? In this day, when this was being written, having multiple wives was not unusual for a person who had enough economic power to support more than one, and that's kind of how their culture worked. But there's still a hesitation there, isn't there? It is a hesitation. You should not have too many wives. And it's, again, interesting the way it says it. It doesn't define it as one, but not many. And again, there's a purpose in that. Why not more than? What's the limitation? What's the reason for that? maybe I'll ask you, Helen, did you catch what the reason for not having too many wives was?
No, I'm reading that right now. I'm
Okay.
going through it again. Because I'm at the part where it says he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away.
Right. Okay, so there it is. So it's not a moral thing. You can't have more than one wife, but it is an issue of what happens if you have too many wives. And I think we see this played out again. It's going to take 500 or 600 years. But when we get to the lives of some of the famous kings like King David or King Solomon, King David had a number of wives, and King Solomon had more than you could count. He had what 500, 600, 800 wives? I'm not sure. The number is astronomical. I don't know what that's all about. But again, what we see happen in the Solomon story is that because he is taking wives, foreign wives, and as a king, he could do that because that became part of how you made peace treaties with other kings, is you would give them your daughters to marry so that you wouldn't want to go and conquer their people, and they would give you their daughters. And so they would have these alliances that were kind of brought together through marriage. And that was not an unusual way of doing alliances and kingdom building for thousands of years. It's not the way we do it anymore, but that was something that was done. And so again, the idea that if you have too many wives, especially wives from foreign places, they're not going to be about the same things you are, about being part of the covenant people, and they will take your heart away from what it should be. So, okay, that's another one. Good. Let's go into there's a few more. What are some other things that we're not to have too much of, and what are some things that we are to do?
Acquire many horses for himself.
Good. Now you might say, what's God have against horses? You know, horses are pretty. Horses are nice. What's up with that? Cassie, what do you think? What's the reason why a king should not have too many horses?
I'm not sure. Is it in a sense that he's keeping them for himself only? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I'm not expecting that you would know. The idea of the horse, though, in again, this is part of the historical lens. In the idea of the horse, roughly 4,000 years ago, was that kings who had many horses would be a mighty army to deal with, because the horse was a great weapon in battle. If you had an army and you had no horses, an army that came with horses had a huge advantage over you. So the idea that the horse becomes kind of symbolic of military power or military might. Now, it'd be easier if he had said that, but of course, in this day and age that this was written, that's exactly what the horse represented. And so, you know, for us today, you know, a couple thousand years later, we can say, well, part of what this seems to be indicating is that whoever this king is should not come with great military strength or depend completely on his military strength. Because again, from other parts of this, what should the king be relying upon? A good king, a great king. Okay, let me back it up. Okay, backing it up. I'll ask a different question, but a different way. Okay, let's go a little bit further. What are some other things now? Not only things he should not do, but what are some of the things that the king should do? Because I think that's going to give us the other side of it. We mentioned one, he should not be a foreigner. And that was kind of said a couple different ways. He should be one of your own community, or he should not be a foreigner. Why? Does God not like foreigners? Or why should that be? But there's a few others here that are going to kind of go on the same theme. What else is there that they should do?
Is it that they should have read the law, and it says that, and he shall read it in all of the days of his life, so that he may
Yes.
learn to fear the Lord.
Right. That's exactly it, Julia. Thank you. Yeah, that's getting it. That's the second half of that equation. One, he should be part of the covenant community, and two, he should remain faithful to the covenant by reading the law, have the law written for him in a way that he can then read it every day, so that he can follow the law and its statutes, and keep his heart in the right place as he leads his people in the right way of being God's covenant community. So again, that goes to the idea of the foreigner. That's the idea. It's not that there's anything wrong with someone who is an outsider, but if you have someone who is the leader of God's covenant people, but he's not part of the covenant people, he doesn't understand the covenant, he doesn't understand what that covenant means for their relationship to God, then that person's not going to be able to be a good king. And same, even if you have a member of the covenant community, but he doesn't bother to read the covenant, doesn't bother to read the laws or follow the laws, then he's not going to be a good leader for the covenant people either. And so what you have described in all of these is really a king or a leader who is not like other kings or other leaders, because kings and other leaders acquired much wealth for themselves. Kings and other leaders of that day would acquire many wives, and that would be part of how they showed how wealthy they were, by how large a family and how many wives they had. A king or other leaders in their day would have tried to acquire a vast army, especially armies that were filled with horses and horse riders, because that would make their army better than the army next door. So all the things that they would look around and say, these are the things that kings value, don't do those. But these are the things that a king should value, and one is the community. He shouldn't be exalted over other people. He should be one of us. And he should be faithful and humble and following God's rules and God's laws. And that becomes kind of the definition or the job description for what the king was to be. Now, again, if you were to read through the Old Testament, you would be hard pressed to find many kings that could measure up to all of those. Most of them had multiple wives. Many of them had vast wealth. Many of them were great warrior kings and relied on the strength of their generals and their armies. And then, of course, many of the kings didn't bother with reading the covenant, reading the law, or keeping the covenant. So clearly those become the bad kings. But even the good kings often struggled with some of these things because they became part of the norm of what it meant to be a king. But we see in this section here that God is almost laying a foundation down. He says, no, this is what it means to be a great person of character, a great leader, and has to do with humility, has to do with not putting yourself above other people, has to do with sticking to the values of the community and the covenant that they live under. And so that becomes kind of the job description. And I think kind of a fun way of beginning to open up, it's a different world that we're talking about when we're looking back at these old texts. And yet still there are things here that we can bring forward. I had a lot of fun. Well, we could get political. We won't. If we were in class together, we would be kicking it around. And whoever was the current president or most recent president of our memory, we would kick around and say, okay, how does this work for the job description for a president or a governor or a leader? And we would find out that it doesn't really fit very well because we don't do this. Maybe we should, but we don't do this very well. We don't value the person who adheres most to the covenant. We don't value that sense of finding his strength in his trust in God rather than his military might or his wealth or his status. Those are things that always seem to win out. But that's what it has here. That the king that God would have would be quite different than our views of greatness. So, so again, that's a little bit of backdrop for you. It's a little bit of even backdrop for that assignment, that 3-1. That again, I think what we're going to find in your assignment is that they will have some people who will talk about greatness and put it in the context that's going to fit very well with what Jesus spoke about greatness, or how Craybill describes greatness, the idea of being a servant leader, and we'll see that sometimes that fits with how people think of greatness, and sometimes is completely foreign or opposite of how it actually works out. So, okay, we got one more passage, and I've been kind of playing with this one for a while, so I want to move into it. We'll have you guys move forward, and I don't know if the page thing is going to continue to be, but on page 467, I would have you turn to the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 11. Okay, and when we get to, okay, in the ebook, Cassie, is it still the same page? Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Cassie. Okay. Okay, so in chapter 11, it begins a story, and it's going to go for about 2 chapters long, and we don't know if we'll read all of it through or not. But it's a story about a great character of the Bible. It's a character by the name of King David, and he becomes kind of the epitome of what it means to be a great king. As we open it, we're going to read at least the first chapter, maybe chapter and a half. If we have time, maybe we'll get to the end of the chapter, but we'll see kind of, I want you to see from a literary world point of view, how the author of the story kind of crafts the story. And I'm going to have you look at it, and we're going to talk about it. Also, I'll give you the questions we're going to look at, and then we'll read it, and then we'll come back and answer some of the questions. But just notice some of the questions I'm going to ask. You know, how does a story open? How does it close? You know, is there, and that, I'll tell you there is. It's real obvious how the story begins and how it's kind of framed. But we're going to look at some key things here. One is character and character development. So as we read through the story, just be aware if there's a primary character who's driving the story in any way, let's listen for how they're described. Let's watch how they're developed. And then ask that second level question, do I seem to sympathize with this character, or does this person seem to be kind of not very sympathetic? Because I will tell you that's not by accident. That's going to be intentional. That the author here is the way he describes the characters is intentional to get us to see the moral of the story that he's wanting us to see without saying it out loud. One of the characters in the story is going to be a woman by the name of Bathsheba. But as we read through it, please notice how she is described, or by what names she is called, because she's kind of referred to a little differently than anybody else. And so there's going to be some significance there. I want to just kind of play with that a little bit. So we'll talk about, once we get to the end, we'll come back around to that. Also watch in the story, again, this is just structural questions, literary world. You know, what are some of the, you know, who does most of the action? Who drives the action, makes things happen in the story? And which aspects of the story do we seem to have a lot of time spent on? Because again, that's probably not by accident. The author is doing this in a way that the more time spent is going to bring more emphasis to these sections. So those are some of the questions. We'll come back and we'll kick around as we move forward. So, but we're going to start here. I'll kick out of these questions because we don't need those now. And we'll come back to our group here. Okay, so in chapter 11, it says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all the all Israel with him. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rebah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Okay, I mentioned in the video this week, maybe you saw it, clearly, just the way the author opens up the story, he is saying something that we're about to read is going to be out of place because something is going on here. The spring of the year when kings go out to battle, David did not. And he doesn't say that, but he clearly says that this is what he should have been doing, paying attention to being a king, going out and leading his army. But instead he stayed behind in Jerusalem. So what's going to happen next is being set up as something because David wasn't doing what he should have been doing. David fell into something that he should not have been doing. And we're going to read about that and again, see how the biblical author here kind of frames his story. And again, uses the various characters to make his point. What is his point? We'll get to that. But how he uses the other characters to help define the point is kind of what we're going to be looking at here. So first volunteer, pick us up there at verse 2 and take us just for the next, say, through verse 5. And then we'll take a little longer stretch going from 6 to verse 13 or so. So next reader, see, Helen, you were our first reader. So Cassie or Julia, I want you to kick us off in verse 2.
I could do it.
Okay.
It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, this is Bathsheba,
Very good.
daughter of Eliam, the wife of
Uriah.
the Hittite.
Good.
That was
Hittite. Yes, okay. Yeah, sometimes you got to just spell it out and rough it out. It's just, again, is it important? Yeah, it's important in the context of the story. Is it important in the big picture? Not at all. But there are reasons why this fellow Uriah, why he is described as a Hittite. And there's also going to be a reason that he gets introduced here along with this beautiful woman, Bathsheba, who is spotted while she is bathing. So go ahead, continue on.
So David sent the messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. Okay, so now we know. Instead of being out to war with his troops like he should have been, something else is going on. We've got a problem, don't we? Clearly, this king, as good as he may be, isn't reading the law code every day and doing what is right. Instead, he is doing some things that are clearly against the covenant that God had established for his people. Okay. So, Cassie, would you read for us, say, verse 6 through about verse 13?
So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, Go down to your house and wash your feet. Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house. David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house.
Okay. So, real quick, Cassie, what is David is attempting to do here from your learned position here? What is the story all about so far?
He's kind of been not taking charge of what's going on outside of where sorry.
That's okay.
So they're out to war, but he's not really keeping up to date with that.
No, because he's distracted, isn't he?
Yes.
He's distracted with something else. And what is the something else that he's distracted with, Helen? What is the king paying most attention to at this point?
What happened to be the woman?
Yes, happens to be the woman, and something's going on here that he's trying to now cover up. What do you think, Julia? What do you think the reason that he has invited this previously very anonymous soldier, Uriah the Hittite, why did he invite him back to Jerusalem? Why specifically him? And why is he plying him with alcohol every night? To what's David's motivation here?
I'm not too sure. I'm trying to, that's what I've been thinking about. I'm not too sure. I don't know what it could be. Maybe to distract the fact that that David just remained in Jerusalem and he's supposed to be somewhere else.
Okay.
I'm not too sure.
That's fair enough. And I think that's again, one of the challenges we have with these old stories. We say, what is going on here? Why do I need to even know this? This is kind of a weird story of David not acting very noble. He's gotten another woman pregnant who is not his wife, and now he's doing these weird things, this weird plan. What's going on, Cassie?
So Uriah is the father of the daughter that he impregnated, right?
No, Uriah is the husband of the woman he has impregnated. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So he's trying to distract the fact that he impregnated her?
Sure. Yeah. And that's probably what he is. What do you think his motive was? To bring Uriah home, to get him drunk, and then expected maybe Uriah would what? Probably go to his house, to his wife, so that later on this year, when his wife is pregnant, it would not be a surprise that she turns out pregnant when all the other women are not, because all of their husbands were off to war. But oh yeah, that's right. Uriah came home for that time, didn't he? Ah, okay. So what's going on here is there is a scandal that right now only David and Bathsheba know about. And they're trying to develop a cover story. How can we justify Bathsheba being pregnant without it coming out that David is the father? And so That's what's going on with all this weird, let's get Uriah drunk, maybe he'll go to his wife, but Uriah doesn't, and Uriah has all this good reason why not to. It's like all my friends, all my colleagues are out living out in these tents. They're out fighting the war. You know, who am I? I'm going to come home and enjoy my wife? No way. You know, they don't get a chance to enjoy their wife. That wouldn't be right. That wouldn't be fair. I would go back to the war and they'd give me crap for it. So I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to be united with my comrades in arms, and I'm not going to go back to my house. This surprises David, doesn't it? Because he expected that Uriah was going to do the obvious thing, which would be want to go home and sleep with his wife. Okay. So when it doesn't work and he does the second night, he is drunk, but he doesn't go back to his house, instead sleeps there on the couch with the servants of the king. In verse 14, it says, I'll read a little bit here for a while, then I'll give it to somebody else. In verse 14, it says, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, that's his general, and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In other words, Uriah is carrying the letter to Joab. And in the letter, he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so that he will be struck down and die. So as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of his servants of David among them fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. So then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know they would come out and shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman throw a upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Okay, that's just a little aside. You can blow that off. That's a historical aside that made sense 3,000 years ago. It makes no sense to us now, except it is the general expecting the king's going to say, you should have known better than getting that close to the wall. Why did you go so near the wall? Then you will say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So, messenger comes home in verse 22. A reader who would read for us through 27. So 22 to 27.
Is it so? Oh.
Okay, Helen, go ahead.
So 22 through 27.
Yep.
No, my page just changed. I'm sorry. Okay.
That's okay.
We're on 468, correct?
Yep.
Okay, 22. It says, so the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab, his name's Joab, right? Just to confirm.
Perfect.
Had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back in the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants.
People with bows and arrows, yeah.
From the wall, some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this trouble you, for the sword devours. Now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it and encourage him. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him.
It's like grieving or mourning, yeah.
When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son.
Okay, so to catch us up on the story, and I don't want to get too deep into the story, but it's kind of interesting so far. Okay, so we have a problem. The king doesn't do what he should do, and so in fact what he's doing is what he shouldn't do. That becomes kind of the theme of this story, is that he sleeps with another man's wife, he impregnates her, he hatches a plan to cover it up. I'll bring Uriah home to sleep with her so people will think that it is simply their child. And it'll be done. Bathsheba won't say anything to anybody else. I won't say anything, and it'll just be, we'll go on as if nothing ever happened. This is before DNA or paternity tests, so they would never know. So this was a great plan, but it didn't work because, and we'll talk about Uriah in a few minutes. Uriah does not go and sleep with his wife, and that becomes then one of the contrasts of the story, is Uriah's integrity versus David's lack of integrity. And to the point where David then has to go to a plan B. Plan B would be, I'll send word with him to the general. The general makes sure that he dies in battle, and he does. So not only does he commit adultery and then hatch a plan to deceive, but then he also hatches a plan to murder a man. And we assume that Bathsheba doesn't know about this plan, but in fact, she simply mourns his passing when he is dead. But after her mourning is over, David, being the good man that he is, steps in and said, this poor widow, how is she going to fend for herself? Poor Uriah is dead. I guess I'll have to take her into my house just because I'm a good and gracious person. Not because she's so beautiful and not because I've wanted her all along, but I'm going to do this, and everyone in the kingdom thinks, what a noble thing this David is doing. Isn't he a good guy? Now, in real time, they probably did think David was being an incredibly noble character. What a great king we have. He's even taking into his own home and caring for in his own home, caring for the widows of some of the men who have been lost in battle. What a great guy he is. But as the story goes on, we see that the narrator is not wanting us to see how great David is. We're wanting to see exactly the opposite. And so he introduces yet another character here. And so it goes on in verse 1. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And so the Lord sent Nathan, this is in the last character in the story, Nathan to David. Nathan is a prophet, and he comes and tells David a story. He says, there were two men. This is the story that the prophet says. There were two men in a certain city. One was rich, the other was poor. And the rich man had many flocks and many herds, but the poor man had nothing but one small ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him, with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock and the herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him, but he took the poor man's lamb, and he prepared it for his guest that had come to him. When David heard this, his anger was greatly kindled against that man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Verse 7, Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. I anointed you over king of Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that were too little, I would have added much more. So why have you despised the word of the Lord and to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and taken his wife to be your wife, and you have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, and you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. I'll stop there because we could go on, and we hear how the story does play out. But again, here the role of Nathan comes to reveal to David that though he may have thought that it was done in secret, the prophet knows, and because the prophet knows, even if nobody else in the kingdom knows, God knows. And that becomes part of the moral of the story. The things that are done in secret, though we have great plans to try to keep them secret, will come to light because God sees what is done in secret and reveals that which is done in the darkness. That is part of the story. But going back to our questions, and I want to hold on to this thought, let's just take a look at those questions once again and ask and just walk them through. How is the story crafted and how are the characters developed? Who's telling the story? Anyone want to jump in and just throw out an answer? This is a pretty easy one, actually.
Is it just the narrator?
Yeah, that's the answer. Narrator. Yeah, could be David, could be somebody else, but it's not clearly. It's the narrator. He's not pulling any punches. He is narrating the story for us. I'll tell you how the story ends. You know how the story begins. How does the story begin?
David stays in his kingdom and doesn't go to war with the rest of his people.
Right. And so, and the story ends with David finally going out to battle because they have finally overtaken the city and it is going to fall. So David goes and the city falls. But it is really not about the battle for this city, is it? It's really about what's going on here in this character study between David, primarily the main character. But who is the secondary character? Who would you say of all the characters, who gets the most development? David does, because we get to hear what he's thinking. We get to see kind of his both his actions as well as the consequences. But who else gets a lot of development in the story?
Would it be Joab?
He plays a big role, but he really doesn't get developed. Do you ever know what Joab's thinking or what he's really doing, other than he's following the orders of the king?
And what about his wife?
Bathsheba.
Yeah, Sheba.
Okay, again, I'll ask the same question, Helen. What do you know about what Bathsheba is thinking? Did you hear any of her own words or any of her own thoughts in the midst of the story?
No, I mostly heard her just kind of just going along with things.
Yeah, Bathsheba is interesting because when, I'll be honest, before I started teaching this class, if you had asked me, I would say, okay, I know that story because I've heard that story many times. And I would say the two main characters are David and Bathsheba, but it really isn't that. Bathsheba has a big role, but she doesn't get developed. We don't know much about her. About the only thing we know about her is, well, there's a couple things. One, she's beautiful. And two, she is another man's wife. Other than that, what do we know about her? Not much. She doesn't get hardly any development at all. No, the character who gets developed most, probably next to David, would be Uriah. He's the one that we get to know a little bit. He's the one who we kind of hear him interacting with David. The whole, why didn't you go down to sleep with your wife? Oh, it's because I've got too much integrity for that. I'm not going to do that and have my brothers out in the field have to stay out in the field and suffer out there. And so we see this entanglement between David, this little dance between David and Uriah. And in which of the two characters did you find more, well, sympathetic is the word here for us, but I want to use maybe a different word. No, I'll go use sympathetic. Who do you feel sympathy towards in the story?
I would say Uriah.
Mm-hmm.
Just because he was trying to do the right thing, and even when David got him to go back and he was drinking and everything, and he didn't really fall up to the plan that David had to try to conceal the pregnancy. And then even then he was, like we talked about earlier, he was just trying to do the right thing. And David had to go to another plan to, I guess, get him out of the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, so you feel kind of in the midst of the story, you feel kind of drawn to the integrity and kind of the sad plight. I mean, what does Uriah do wrong in this story that leads to his death? Absolutely nothing. What does David do wrong? And it's almost like we can't count the number of things that David does wrong in the midst of this story. And so you see two characters here that are kind of set side by side. You have one who is a great example of greatness or integrity, and you have another who is a terrible example, or maybe a fantastic example of lacking integrity, or the opposite of greatness. And surprisingly enough, the opposite of greatness is David. And why I say surprising is because David is probably considered the greatest king of ancient Israel. And in the biblical record, he's always the one that people look back to say, this king was great, very much like David. So David gets all this notoriety for being a great king, but in this story, we see that he is very flawed. And when it comes to greatness, he does not exhibit the attributes of greatness. Good. Okay. Did you catch that? What are some of the names that Bathsheba is referred to? And why do you think she was never referred to merely as Bathsheba?
Is she just referred to, because I highlighted a couple of times, just as the woman, even before they said her name?
Yeah.
And after, they just referred to her as the woman?
Yeah, she is referred to as the woman before we find out who she is. And once she's referred to by name, it's almost never, in fact, I want to say it is never, merely Bathsheba, but she always carries at least one other title. It might be the wife of Uriah the Hittite, or it might be the daughter of Eliam, but it's never going to be merely Bathsheba, which is really an interesting piece as well. I think there's something that the narrator, which is almost odd to me, really, because this story is 3,000 years old, and in that day, you would expect the women to be kind of looked down upon. But I think this is almost in a way of reminding us not to be victim shaming here. Because sometimes we say, well, you know, she didn't have to show herself to the king. She didn't have to sleep with him or get pregnant. She also has part of this problem. But I think the way that even the author of the story always refers to her as somebody's daughter or somebody's wife, kind of gives us some clues that she is really not an agent acting on her own. And so she doesn't bear the same responsibility in the story that, for example, David does, because it is his sin that is on display, that is contrasted with Uriah's integrity. And I think the author in a way is kind of saying, so don't blame Bathsheba for being beautiful, and don't blame Bathsheba for being seductive. Don't say she has half of the problem here. This is David's sin. And by doing that, I think it's kind of, again, drawing attention to David's sin, because that is what we're called to look at and see. What events, let's jump down to number 8. What events does the narrator spend the most time kind of sometimes almost redundantly dealing with?
On David's planning on how he's going to hide everything.
Yeah, it's the plot, isn't it? That we get to hear him come up with the plot. We get to hear him describe the plot in his letter to Joab. We get to hear Joab talk about how he carried out the plot. And so, yeah, it is. So what the narrator is saying, this is the problem. You know, the initial sin was bad, but it's the not coming clean. It is the trying to cover. It is the creating a bigger problem because you're not wanting to deal with the original problem. That really is the thing that has the most gravity. And so again, what we're seeing here is a story that has a moral to it, a number of morals to it. But he doesn't come out and say, this is the moral of the story. The narrator leaves it for us to kind of pick and choose as we're able to hear the story, to come to these conclusions on our own. And I think it's, you know, it's crafted in such a way that we are then left with this question mark. What is the point of the story? If we're looking at it at that third level, you know, what is the point of this story? Not so much how does it fit in the larger picture or the meta narrative, but how does it fit here? We are able to come to some conclusions because we see the way the story is told gives us some indication of what he wants us then to feel. Okay. Last thing on this, and then we'll jump back off. It's interesting, the whole Bathsheba and what she is called, because she does come up in the story. From here on, she's referred to as David's wife. Stop share. And she does become a very key role in ancient Israel. She becomes the mother of a number of David's children, including one whose name will be Solomon, who will become the next king of Israel. So of all the wives that David had, the queens of Israel at that time, she became a very significant one because not only was she the queen's wife, but she also becomes the queen mom for the next king who comes along. And so she becomes a real significant character herself. But even in the New Testament, this is again 1,000 years later, when Matthew is describing the genealogy of Jesus, and saying these are the people who are part of Jesus' ancestry. David is mentioned, but also this woman, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, gets mentioned in the story of Jesus' lineage. So yeah, it was through her line that Jesus would also come. But again, even in the book of Matthew, when Matthew is looking back, he doesn't refer to her as, yeah, she was Bathsheba, and she bore the son Solomon, who would become in this line to Jesus. But she even there, 1,000 years later, she's referred to as the woman who was the husband of Uriah the Hittite. Again, Matthew kind of giving a little nod to this story and the sin of David and the frailty, the fallenness really of all of us, which is kind of interesting piece that he would bring that into the story of Jesus and his ancestry. Okay, you know what we're going to do? I'm going to jump over my Matthew 18 section because I want to just touch on this idea of greatness as I launch you into this week. That there's a number of things that we'll have you do, including that 3-1, the survey of what it means to be great. We've got a couple of chapters in Craybill to read this week, and a couple of chapters on some of the New Testament. Again, mostly looking at it, what does the world consider great, and how does the Bible describe it as great? So we will leave it there for you, just to kind of walk out and continue to do the readings that we have on greatness as we move forward. So questions on either the story of King David in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, or any questions you have from the Moodle this week that you've seen in the way of the assignments that we have on tap. Yeah, there are some assignments that I've taken out, and so you might see the numbers don't exactly line up. You might miss one or two this week, because those are assignments that we've taken out of the mix because we wanted to cover them either tonight in the conversation around Deuteronomy or in the 2 Samuel, but also but the numbers sometimes get thrown off. So if you have a question, wait a minute, where was 3.4? I don't see it. It's because it's been removed from the list of assignments.
For 3.1, not the survey question, but the other one, the essay, where it says 2 to 3 pages. Do we do the 2 to 3 pages based on the response and kind of get key points from the Bible on those questions that were
Yes.
given to us?
Exactly. What I have you do is kind of analyze what you find from your survey. You can either go specifically answer by answer, or just kind of in general. Again, when people refer to greatness, you're going to find it's going to be different types of categories, depending on what you have. Some lists lean more towards great people who are famous. LeBron James, because he is a great basketball player, or Barack Obama, because he is a great example for Black people in our world today. Or you'll find people, or you'll get an artist of some sort, an actor or a singer, or someone who is really good at what they do, maybe the most popular person going right now, because people will describe someone who is great based on what it means to be better than everybody else. And so, for example, a great basketball player, scores more points than anybody else. So they may base it that way. You may find others who are going to say, well, there are great people who shaped history, and they may pick someone from history, say Martin Luther King Jr. or John F. Kennedy or Abraham Lincoln or Alexander the Great, because it's even in his name. You may find people who do things like that where they grab historical characters because influencing the world would be their definition of greatness. Or you might have some people who pick out just someone because they think they have a great character, a quality of character, or because they do things for them. For example, sometimes I have kids say, well, who's great? My mom is great because she takes care of everything I need, and she does this for me. And so you hear that maybe from that perspective, someone who is sacrificial or caring, those are the characteristics that we deem as great. Okay, so that's part of it. That's part A. Part two is then to take those characteristics that whatever you heard, kind of reflect on those from either the biblical teachings that you'll see today in the teachings of Jesus, or the Craybill or Grimsrud teachings about how they see greatness in the Bible. And so do a little interacting with your reading material, do a little interacting with the Bible material, how the characteristics that are deemed as great by your surveyors either line up with the biblical or are in opposition, or there's either a resonance with it or an oppositional view of the greatness as your reading gives you. Okay.
Thank you.
Gosh, that was a terribly awkward and long and rambling. It's really not that hard of an assignment, and I made it sound really, really difficult. You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, well then we will finish with this. I will read for you a little passage of scripture. This is an interesting one. It goes further, and usually I would go longer than this, but I only want to take it a little bit. When Jesus was asked about greatness in chapter 18 of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was asked specifically a question: who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And so didn't necessarily say who is the greatest person on earth or what makes greatest here on earth, but the question has to do with, in God's kingdom, in God's ways, what does greatness look like, Jesus? And this is what Jesus did. He called a child, and he put that child on his lap. Actually, he says, to whom he brought among them. And he said, truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name also welcomes me. He goes on in the rest of that chapter to talk about greatness in a few different ways, but that's really an interesting way that Jesus would say there is something of greatness that can be seen not only in this child, but in whoever also becomes humble like this child, because people who are humble like this child will be considered great in God's kingdom plan. And so I'll leave it there for you. That's one of the things that Jesus said that kind of was upside downing. He took a child that probably was otherwise overlooked,